In the long, brutal saga of human justice, there are punishments, and then there are messages carved into flesh. Lingchi was never just about death. It was about control, about fear, about sending a message to an entire civilization, that the body is not your own, that your soul can be punished, and that dignity dies long before the heart does. This wasn't execution. It was theater. For over 2,000 years in Imperial China, Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, was reserved not merely for criminals but for the condemned of empire. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was designed to keep the victim conscious for as long as possible while their body was peeled away, slowly, deliberately, publicly. And what made it even more horrifying is that in Confucian belief, mutilation of the body meant mutilation of the soul. So the punishment followed you even after death. This video is not about gore. It's not about spectacle. It's about power, and the terrifying lengths human beings will go to preserve it. We'll walk you through the rituals, the philosophy, the betrayals, the photographs that shocked the Western world, and the eerie fact that even after its abolishment, Lingchi kept showing up, not in courtrooms but in collective memory. If you're someone who seeks truth not wrapped in sentiment, but carved in reality, you're in the right place. Before we descend into this abyss, support this kind of raw, untamed history. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment what part of this dark history shocks you most. You're helping this channel reach the people who actually want to understand how power works, not just how it's written in textbooks. Because this was history written in screams. Let's begin where it all started, not in the back rooms of a palace, but in the eyes of a society that believed your body belonged to your family, your soul to the heavens, and your punishment to the emperor. Lingchi wasn't invented to kill. It was invented to erase. There was a system to it, a rhythm. This wasn't chaotic violence, it was a ceremony of dismemberment. The condemned would be dragged, usually in silence, to a public square. Stripped. Bound upright to a wooden frame. The crowd, peasants, nobles, children, would already be gathering. Not to grieve, but to watch. Then came the knife. It was short, sharp, honed for precision, not power. The executioner was not a brute, he was a trained artist of suffering. His role was not to kill quickly but to keep the heart beating, the pain real, the shame infinite. The first cuts were shallow. The outer flesh of the chest, thighs, shoulders, meant to bleed, not break. Next came the muscles, sliced in strips like ribbons of red silk. Then the genitals, the hands, the feet, piece by piece. The final stages were optional: eyes, nose, ears. Not always performed, but when they drew cheers. And still, the victim might be alive. If the sentence prescribed 100 cuts, the executioner was expected to land exactly that. No more, no less. And only after the final one, a stab to the heart, or a cleaving blow to the neck, was the condemned allowed to die. But some executioners were bribed by family. Others silently merciful. They would kill early, sometimes with the first strike, and perform the rest of the cuts on a corpse. This wasn't just torture. It was a spiritual annihilation. You see, under Confucian law, the body was a sacred inheritance from your parents. To die whole was to honor your lineage. But to be cut into pieces? That meant you would wander the afterlife disfigured, disgraced, detached from your ancestors. Lingchi wasn't just pain. It was exile from eternity. And even the living knew it. Families of the condemned would often be shunned. Wives forced to remarry in shame. Children forbidden from carrying the family name. It was a punishment that bled through generations. So ask yourself this: was this justice? Or was it a message? Because to those in power, it didn't matter whether the accused was guilty or not. What mattered was that everyone watching believed it could be them next. Behind every cut was a name. And behind every name, a story of betrayal, injustice, or cold political calculation. Lingchi didn't just claim criminals. It consumed generals, scholars, concubines, priests, and even children. One of the most tragic victims was Yuan Chonghuan, a Ming dynasty general who had spent his life defending China's borders from the Jurchens, the ancestors of the Manchu. He was brilliant, loyal, victorious, but that made him dangerous. In 1630, envious rivals whispered treason into the emperor's ear. And without trial, without question, Yuan was sentenced to Lingchi. In his final hours, he didn't curse. He wrote, "A lifetime of merit scattered like dust. Half my career, a dream. But fear not. Though I fall, my soul still guards the frontier." As the blade opened his flesh, he stared ahead. Silent. Proud. The crowd cheered, unaware that they were watching the mutilation of their own protector. Then there was concubine Duan, a young woman serving under the depraved Emperor Jiajing, a man obsessed with alchemy, convinced that consuming the menstrual blood of virgin girls would grant him immortality. Palace maids, barely teenagers, were forced into these rituals. They were beaten, starved, treated like vessels. One day, a handful of them plotted to strangle him. But fear broke them, and one ran to betray the others. The entire group, including concubine Duan, was sentenced to Lingchi. Even the girl who reported them was not spared. They were cut to pieces, their families enslaved or executed. All because one man's madness demanded obedience masked as ritual. Then came Lu Jin, a eunuch who rose to power under the Ming dynasty by eliminating rivals. Ruthless, corrupt, but smart. Too smart. He made enemies in every direction. Accused of treason, perhaps falsely, perhaps not, he was given 3,000 cuts over 3 days. Spectators paid to watch. Some even bought bits of his flesh, dipped it in wine and drank, believing it would cure ailments or ward off evil. Even in death he was consumed. And then there were the forgotten, nameless teenagers with mental illness, wives falsely accused of poisoning husbands, priests caught in geopolitical webs. Each one cut not for what they did, but for what they symbolized. These weren't executions. They were performances. And every performance needed an audience. For centuries, the horror of Lingchi lived in silence. No paintings. No scrolls. No public record, just memory, rumor, and the echo of screams buried in dirt and dynasty. But then came the camera. And with it, the quiet shame of a nation became the loud horror of the world. In the 19th century, as European powers crept deeper into Asia, armed with missionaries, opium, and diplomatic arrogance, they stumbled across a spectacle they couldn't explain, yet couldn't look away from. Lingchi was still being practiced. Not in shadow but in sunlight. Publicly. Legally. Performed by the state as a warning. And then, they photographed it. In 1904, French soldiers stationed in China captured one of the most infamous Lingchi executions in history, the death of Wang Weiqin, a Qing official who had murdered an entire family. Bound to a wooden frame, he was sliced apart, not just by the blade but by the lens. 12 photos. 12 postcards. Printed. Published. Sold in markets. Some mailed across the world as souvenirs. Suddenly, Europe saw what China had kept behind: ritual and order. A justice system soaked in blood and humiliation. 1 year later, in 1905, another execution was photographed. This time, a mentally ill boy who had killed his mother. Too young to vote, too sick to reason, but still sentenced to be dissected alive in a crowd. His final image was later published in a French psychology textbook. Not as history but as a case study in madness. The West, of course, condemned it. Not because it cared for the victims, but because it had proof. Proof to declare moral superiority. Proof to justify civilizing missions. British diplomats like Sir Thomas Francis Wade pushed for legal reforms. Writers like George Morrison wrote detailed accounts, dripping with both horror and condescension. The message was clear: we are advanced. They are not. But the question lingered: why did it take a photograph for the world to care? The truth is, it wasn't the cruelty that shocked them. It was the clarity. The camera didn't just capture flesh being cut. It captured the fragility of civilization. The fine line between justice and performance. Between law and spectacle. Between punishment and pleasure. Because what the West saw in those images, whether they admitted it or not, was a reflection of themselves. And the realization that even civilized nations carry knives. They just hide them better. March 1905. With the stroke of an imperial pen, Lingchi was outlawed. 2,000 years of sanctioned torture. Gone in a single decree. But death by 1,000 cuts didn't vanish. Not really. Moved. Out of the courts. Out of the crowd. And into the shadows of modern thought. The final known execution, Fu Zhuli, a Mongolian guard accused of assassinating a prince, took place after the law had banned it. April 13, 1905. 12 photographs. Turned into postcards. Sold on the street like theater flyers. Some still exist. Faded. But sharp enough to remind us what civilization once called justice. And yet, the blade lingers. Today, criminologists and psychologists still reference Lingchi, not for its history but as a metaphor. For punishment that destroys the self slowly. Cut by cut. Layer by layer. We see it in prisons where inmates are isolated until they forget their names. We see it in war zones where trauma doesn't strike once. It repeats like a blade never finished. We see it in systems where the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless, are punished endlessly not by swords but by bureaucracy, surveillance, poverty. Lingchi never truly needed a knife. It needed silence, an audience, a justification. But there were always voices, even in ancient times, who said, enough. In the Song dynasty, Lu Yu, a failed scholar turned moral official, stood alone and condemned Lingchi for violating Confucian ideals. He was ignored but not forgotten. Centuries later, modern reformers like Xin Jiabin and Wu Tingfang echoed that same cry. They had seen Europe. They had read the books. And they knew, a nation that carves up its own citizens cannot call itself civilized. Their fight, their words, their reforms, they mattered. Because the end of Lingchi didn't come from horror. It came from courage. From people who understood that true justice is not about revenge. It's about restraint. It's about choosing to not strike, even when you can. So if this history disturbs you, let it, because it should. But don't look away. Don't dismiss it as ancient. Don't say, that was then. Because in every system, every generation, and every society, there is always someone sharpening the knife. And there must always be someone brave enough to stop it.